Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is a reading of Player vs. Player by Reyna's Epic on AO3. This is a particularly violent fiction, so if you're not into that, if it's triggering for you, then I would listen to something else, go watch something else you enjoy. It doesn't have to be for me, I don't have a lot going on, but as always, I hope you do enjoy if you're going to continue listening, and have a good time. Let me know what you think. Bye! The expression, burning the candle at both ends, was one that Marcy had become infinitely familiar with at a young age. To be fair to her, it was simple biology that cursed her with insomnia, not her own desires. However, she quickly found the best ways to take advantage of the extra time she'd been given. To call her obsession with all things media-related, video games, books, comics, TV shows, stage plays, literally anything she could get her hands on, anything other than all-consuming, would be a disservice. She didn't just consume media, she devoured it. It was a scant few months after her 5th birthday before she'd all but exhausted her parents' possible reading material within the house and grown tired of watching the same 7 reruns of SpongeBob on their cheap excuse for a television. Thus began the bi-weekly trips to the library, where she'd check out as many books as she could carry. It was there she finally met Anne and Sasha, and what a sight she must have been to behold. A tiny girl buried beneath piles and piles of books as big as she was, eyes stained a permanent bloodshot hue. It was a wonder they'd even approached her, and an even bigger one that they'd become friends. Then again, perhaps it was inevitable. Marcy didn't consider herself a spiritual person, but being in Utopia had quickly taught her a few things. The world is never what you think it to be, and always much, much bigger. Her appetite for knowledge did not diminish with age, and neither did her insomnia. She grew used to the burning sensation that would build up behind her eyes. She learned to work through the fuzziness her brain would occasionally get after a few too many hours spent awake. And she learned to get whatever precious little minutes of rest she could when her body finally deemed itself ready for it. Insomnia became less of a condition and more a way of life, the only one she'd ever known. Upon arriving in Utopia, she quickly found that there were limits even she could not have predicted. Suddenly, her average amount of sleep went from 4 hours to 2. The burning behind her eyes had escalated to the point where she had to invent eye drops for herself. The fuzziness she'd learned to fight through would occasionally overwhelm her and send her dropping to the pavement wherever she'd be standing. Sleep became less of a scattered but precious resource and more of a luxury. When she wasn't with the night guard, she was researching a way to get back home. And when she wasn't researching a way to get back home, she was training for the guard. And when she wasn't training for the guard, she was improving her tools. And on and on and on. But it was fine. She grew. She adapted. She survived. Life was not easy, but it was still life. And sure, sometimes maybe shapes in the distance would look more like clouds than approaching danger, and maybe sometimes the shadows would leap and dance around her like flames to a fire, but she wouldn't let that stop her. This world had so much to offer, so much to explore, so much to learn that she just couldn't. Then Anne showed up, and Marcy grabbed the candle by both hands before shoving it directly into the fire. 2 hours of sleep became none. The aches in her eyes were permanent, the fuzz in her brain practically mind-numbing. She was sure if she wasn't running on pure adrenaline and bugachinos, she would have collapsed at literally any second. But where her energy failed her, Anne's did not. For every second of misery, there was one of light because Anne was here. She was here, and she was alive, and she was safe. Marcy hadn't really realized just how much she was missing home until it was staring her dead in the face with eyes she knew like the back of her hand. Yes, this world had changed her, just as it had changed herself. But Anne was still Anne. She was just as bright, just as kind, and just as anchoring as she'd always been. A rock for Marcy to stand on, even as the ocean rocked beneath her feet. She was tired, but Anne was there smiling her bright smile. Marcy couldn't help it if she perked up just a bit. If she suddenly found the strength to finish her patrol, complete a report, or read her paperwork. Anne was there, and that was what mattered. They weren't home, not yet, but they were closer. Just by being together, they were that much closer. Then it changed again. Sprig came to get her during one of her rare naps, and she would have found it ironic if she had the consciousness to think about it for longer than 10 seconds. She didn't even remember exactly what he'd said, but just that Anne had disappeared into the sewers and that she was chasing somebody. She'd gone. Of course she did. Because as much evidence as there was to the contrary, she knew that she was competent, and she was the best backup that Anne had when it came to a fight. Anne wasn't an idiot, most of the time. She wouldn't run into a fight without a good reason, especially one that involved running around in the sewers after a little incident they'd had with the sewer gator. So she'd gone after her, armed to the teeth and with a buggettino to go, because the last thing she'd needed was to collapse from exhaustion in the middle of a fight. It wasn't hard to follow Anne's trail. It was lined with the grumbling, bruised bodies of toads who were all too eager to point in the direction of the 2 human girls who had run past earlier. 2. Sasha. That was certainly explaining some things. Anne had told her the details of her and Sasha's fight, and she'd spent the rest of the day mulling over it within the confines of the library. Anne and Sasha never fought. Marcy wasn't sure she'd ever even seen them disagree before, at least not over anything more serious than ice cream flavors. Marcy found Anne and Sasha by the sounds of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion, the taunts tossed back and forth like they meant nothing more than noise. She reached the opening they were in, a maintenance tunnel, just in time to watch Anne land a kick to Sasha's midsection, vaulting off her own sword to do so. Sasha skidded backwards, breath coming in huffs that made her armor rise and fall in waves that made her look much larger than she was. Her glare was fire, actual fire, glowing crimson in the low light. "I was trying to protect you." The words came in a snarl, more animal than human. Anne laughed, and the sound was dry, crackling. "You were protecting yourself." Sasha screamed, and the sound split the ground, rattled the stone, and forced Marcy to screw her eyes closed. Then there was silence. Silence. Marcy pried her eyes open. There was something on the ground. Anne screamed. The trek back was harder, for obvious reasons. Extra weight aside, the adrenaline running through Marcy's veins was enough to shake each of her limbs, forced each of her breaths to come out in heavy, enraged huffs. She'd never felt that angry in her life. Anne's body wasn't limp, not quite, but her head rested in the junction between Marcy's neck and her shoulder like she didn't have the strength to hold it up. Each shaky, warm breath brushed against her skin, a large contrast to the wet chill of Anne's own. Marcy's grip on her waist was slick with sweat and something a bit darker. "I'm sorry," Anne mumbled, for perhaps the 7th time since their walk had started, and Marcy fought the inexplicable urge to cry. "It's not your fault, Anne," she urged once more, adjusting her grip on Anne's arm that was thrown around her neck. The other hung at her side, tied tight with a strip of cloth from Marcy's cloak. It was already dyed a much darker hue. "I'm still sorry," Anne replied, feet scuffling against the stone. Silence prevailed for a few more moments before Anne drew in a large breath. "It's really gone, isn't it?" Marcy couldn't help it if a tear escaped down her face. Heat bubbled in the pit of her stomach. "I'm so sorry, Anne." Anne was quiet for an agonizing moment. The only sound Marcy could hear was that of her ragged breath and the wet squelching of their shoes. We can't come back from this." That made Marcy stop, her feet making squeaking noises on the stone. They stood unmoving, Anne all too eager to stop forcing her legs to move. She sagged against her, and Marcy had to strain to keep them upright. "Hey, we're going to get home," she said, and the words much more confidently than she meant them. And she watched the top of Anne's head shake in what took much too long to register as bitter laughter. I don't mean that." She lifted her head, just for a moment, to fix Marcy with the most tear-stained grin she'd ever seen. Her skin was growing pale. I mean us. You, me, and... The smile disappeared, and her head dipped back down, glancing at her hand, which was no longer there. Sash. Marcy felt her stomach drop, her jaw unclench. Oh, Anne. Anne laughed, and the motion shook her entire body. She reached up to wipe at her face, but there was nothing to do with it, so she just started laughing harder. Tears poured down her cheeks, her legs gave out, and Marcy was forced to go down with her, clutching her by the waist. I thought that there was still a chance. After the tower, I thought... The words came out in hiccups, bitter sobs that trembled in Marcy's hands against her chest, her ribs, her spine. She could feel Anne splitting apart beneath her fingers, and all she could do was hold tight. I thought we could work it out. I'm so sorry. It tasted bitter on her tongue, hollow, because even though she was sorry, she couldn't find it within herself to grieve right then. Not for Sasha. Not for the girl with her friend's blood staining her face, her clothes, her blade. There was no grief or remorse for that. Only the rage that boiled bright beneath her skin. She was my friend! Anne's voice broke, a hoarse cry that echoed around them against the stone. It was washed down Marcy's spine like a bucket of ice. Then, she was my best friend. Oh. I don't want to lose her. So small, so soft, begging, pleading. I don't want to lose her, Marce. She could feel her grip on Anne's waist tightening, but not much else. She was numb, really. Sasha had done this. She had sheared Anne's limb from her body and stood over her corpse. She had permanently wounded, permanently crippled Anne. There was no coming back from this. There was no way to reattach that limb. And Anne had grieved for her, for a lost friendship. Oh. Marcy felt. She wasn't sure, but it hurt. It hurt like a million knives embedded into her chest, twisting and turning and ripping at the flesh. Not only did it hurt, it burned, it ached, and she felt like she was going to be sick, dizzy from the force of it. Anger, no fury, no wrath, spilt from something deep, deep within her and churned itself up into her throat. Something primal made itself home in her chest, and her arms locked around Anne's form, iron and protective. Anne cried in her arms, holding on for dear life with that one hand of hers, grieving for a friend that had lost her way. Marcy cried too, but her tears were not for Sasha. Hey, Marce. They'd started walking again about 10 minutes ago, mostly because Marcy couldn't stomach the idea of leaving Anne without treatment for too long. Her breathing was getting faster, and her skin was becoming slick. Her words had started to slur together. Yes, Anne? You're supposed to keep them talking, right? She wondered. Or is that people who hit their head? Damn it! Of all the things I studied, why was first aid not one of them? You're my best friend, too. Anne's hand made a strange grabbing motion that Marcy thinks was supposed to be a pat on the shoulder, but ended up being more of a caress against her face. Thanks, Anne. She didn't really know how to respond to that. You too? Anne hummed, and she wasn't quite sure if it was in satisfaction or curiosity. I just didn't want you to think I like Sash more than you. Something strangely warm popped into Marcy's chest, and she had to restrain the sudden, inappropriate urge to laugh. She let the word hang for a moment, unsure how to word the warm bubbling in her throat. Have never doubted you, Anne. Anne hummed again, and this time she knew it was out of satisfaction. You're a good one too, Marce. She jostled a little, just enough to bump her head against the side of Marcy's neck. It was a soft, almost nuzzle-like gesture. Marcy felt her expression soften, just a little. Love you too, Anne. Marcy didn't sleep for the next 3 days. Not a single wink. After they got Anne to a hospital, she spent the next several hours with the Newts in surgery, providing the best she could when it came to her very limited knowledge of the human biology. Then, once the wound had been cauterized and wrapped properly, and she'd been permanently scarred for life after watching Anne's barely conscious body suddenly jerk upwards in a scream that rattled the paint off the wall, she'd gone to give her report to the king. Then, somehow, she ended up back at Anne's bedside, and there she stayed for the next 3 days. The planters came as soon as they heard, and it had quickly become a revolving door of Hop Pop and Sprig. She hadn't gone 2 seconds without one of them by her side, their froggy tears left unshed as they struggled to fathom the fact that humans could not grow their limbs back. Sprig had told her a story, late that second night, about how Anne had broken her arm earlier into their stay in Amphibia. It was a toad. Marcy wanted to cry was only part of it. It seemed that all she wanted to do these days, cry and yell and scream at the world for being so unfair, so cruel as to do this to Anne of all people. Anne, who protected her, who looked out for her all these years, who cared enough to cry at their reunion and still tried to protect her even when she didn't need it. Not because she thought she was weak, but because she cared about her. Anne cared about little old nerd Marcy. She didn't tolerate her out of necessity like her parents did, like Sasha had. The name set her whole body aflame. It forced her hands to clench, her teeth to grind, her heart to beat twice as hard against her ribcage. She meant what she'd said. Sasha could come home with them if she got her act together, but she'd rather die than ever let her lay a single finger on Anne again. She would, because Anne cared about her, and she was going to repay that with every fiber of her being, even if it ate her alive.